Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight we're diving into something a little different, something perfectly designed to ease your mind and guide you gently towards sleep. We're exploring the mundane, methodical, and wonderfully tedious realities of survival in times long past. No dramatic battles tonight, no legendary heroes or earth-shaking events. Just the quiet, repetitive rhythms of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to simply make it through another day. So before we begin this gentle descent into historical monotony, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim those lights, maybe adjust your pillow, and let the soft cadence of centuries-old survival techniques wash over you. Tonight, we start with something particularly soothing. The methodical preparation required to survive a Viking winter night. Because nothing says peaceful slumber quite like the detailed logistics of medieval Scandinavian cold weather management. Picture this, you're living in 9th century Norway. The year doesn't matter much because for generations, the routine has remained essentially the same. Winter nights here don't just fall, they descend like a heavy blanket that won't be lifted for months. The sun, when it bothers to appear at all, barely crests the horizon before disappearing again. And in this endless twilight, survival becomes an art form of preparation, patience, and mind-numbing routine. Your day begins long before what you might generously call dawn. The fire in your longhouse hearth has been carefully banked overnight, buried under ash to preserve the coals. This isn't dramatic. There's no roaring blaze to greet the morning. Instead, you kneel beside the stone-lined pit and gently blow life back into the embers. Each breath is measured, deliberate. Too much air and you scatter the precious coals. Too little and they die completely, leaving you to start over with flint and tinder in the bitter cold. The process takes time. Minutes pass as you coax tiny flames from the buried heat. You add kindling piece by careful piece. Thin strips of birch bark first, then progressively thicker twigs. The fire grows with agonizing slowness, but that's perfectly fine. Rush the process and you risk losing everything. This methodical approach to fire building becomes a meditation, a gentle rhythm that will carry you through the day. Once the fire establishes itself properly, you tend to the morning meal preparation. Breakfast in Viking winter isn't about variety or excitement. It's about calories and warmth. You have a large iron pot that hangs from a chain over the fire. Into this goes water, slowly heated until it steams gently in the frigid air. Then comes the porridge. Barley mostly, sometimes oats if the previous harvest was particularly generous. The grains go in gradually, stirred with a long wooden spoon in slow hypnotic circles. The stirring continues for a very long time. There's no hurrying this process. The porridge needs to cook evenly, and the repetitive motion of stirring becomes almost trance-like. Around and around the spoon goes, scraping gently against the iron bottom of the pot. Steam rises in lazy spirals. The mixture slowly thickens. Outside, wind might howl against the timber walls, but inside, there's only the quiet bubble of cooking grain and the soft whisper of the spoon against metal. While the porridge cooks, other preparations continue with the same unhurried pace. Dried fish needs to be soaked in warm water to soften. These are cod or herring, preserved months ago during the brief summer abundance. The fish are rock hard, almost like pieces of wood, and they require patience to become edible again. They sit in wooden bowls, gradually absorbing moisture and returning to something resembling food. The clothing preparation for a winter day follows its own careful routine. Everything must be layered in precise order. First comes the undertunic, made of linen if you're fortunate, wool if you're more typical. This goes on while you're still close to the fire, because once you step away from that heat source, every second of warmth matters. Over this goes the main tunic, longer and heavier. Then the leg wrappings, long strips of wool cloth wound around your legs in careful spirals, each layer overlapping the previous one. Your shoes require special attention in winter. These aren't the simple leather slippers of summer. Winter footwear involves layers. Multiple thick wool socks first, then leather shoes with dry stuff grass or animal fur for insulation. Over these go leather leg guards, carefully laced up the shin. The lacing alone takes several minutes, each eyelet threaded with deliberate care. The leather is stiff from the cold and needs to be worked gently to avoid cracking. The cloak comes last. This is your primary defense against the elements, made from the thickest wool available or, if you're particularly well off, lined with fur. It's heavy enough that putting it on is a process in itself. The bronze or iron brooch that holds it closed must be positioned just right. Too loose and precious warmth escapes. Too tight and you restrict your movement. Finding that perfect balance takes practice and attention. Now comes the daily routine of food management. In summer, you could forage, hunt, or fish to supplement your diet. Winter offers no such flexibility. You survive entirely on what was preserved during the warmer months. This makes every meal an exercise in careful rationing. The dried meat hangs from the rafters in long, dark strips. Each piece must be examined before eating. Is there any sign of spoilage? Has moisture gotten in somewhere? These decisions matter tremendously because there's no replacing what's lost to rot. The root vegetables stored in the underground cellar require daily checking as well. Turnips, onions, and carrots were buried in sand or wrapped in cloth before the first frost. Now they must be inspected regularly and used in order of deterioration. The process is methodical and somewhat tedious. You descend into the cold cellar with a small oil lamp. The light flickers across rows of stored food. You examine each item with the care of someone whose life depends on these provisions. Because it does. Water presents its own winter challenge. The well might freeze. Streams certainly will. And even indoor water containers can develop ice overnight. This means that every drop of liquid water becomes precious. The evening routine involves bringing enough water inside to last until morning, but not so much that it takes up valuable space near the fire. Large ceramic or wooden vessels sit near the hearth, positioned close to avoid enough freezing, but not so close that they crack from thermal expansion. Fuel for the fire requires constant attention throughout the winter day. Wood doesn't cut itself, and the supply diminishes steadily through the long, dark months. Even on the coldest days, someone must venture outside to split logs and bring them in to dry near the fire. This work is repetitive and rhythmic. The axe rises and falls with mechanical precision. Each log splits along the grain with a satisfying crack. The wood is stacked carefully, larger pieces at the bottom, smaller kindling arranged on top, where it can be grabbed quickly when needed. The evening meal preparation begins well before sunset, which in deep winter might be as early as 3 in the afternoon. The same iron pot that cooked breakfast now serves dinner. More porridge, perhaps, or a stew made from preserved meat and root vegetables. Everything goes in slowly, each ingredient added with consideration for how it will affect the final result. The cooking process stretches across hours, not because it needs to, but because there's no reason to rush. Time moves differently in winter when daylight barely exists, and every task must be performed by firelight or oil lamp. The preparation of evening meals becomes a ritual of measured patience. You check the stew every few minutes, lifting the wooden lid and stirring the contents with slow, deliberate movements. The preserved meat has been simmering for hours now, gradually softening from its leather-like consistency into something that can actually be chewed and digested. Steam rises from the pot in gentle clouds, carrying the earthy scent of turnips and the salty tang of dried fish throughout the longhouse. While the meal cooks, other evening preparations begin their own unhurried sequence. The sleeping arrangements for a winter night require careful consideration and methodical execution. Your bed isn't a simple piece of furniture, but rather a complex system designed to preserve body heat through the long hours of darkness. The wooden platform that serves as your bed frame must first be cleared of the day's accumulated debris. Dust, ash, and small bits of bark get swept away with a bundle of birch twigs bound together. Next comes the layering of bedding materials. The foundation consists of thick woolen blankets, folded and refolded until they create a substantial barrier between your body and the cold wood beneath. Over this goes a layer of furs, if you're fortunate enough to own them, or additional wool cloth if you're not. Each layer is positioned with care, overlapping at the edges to eliminate gaps where cold air might penetrate. The process takes considerable time, because getting it wrong means a miserable night of shivering wakefulness. Your pillow requires its own preparation. This isn't a soft, comfortable cushion, but rather a practical arrangement designed for survival. Straw or dried grass gets stuffed into a linen or wool case, but not too firmly. The filling must be adjusted to support your head without creating pressure points that would disturb your sleep. Too much filling and your neck strains uncomfortably. Too little and you wake with a crick that lasts for days. Finding the right balance takes patience and several attempts at adjustment. The evening routine of personal hygiene in Viking winter follows its own peculiar logic. Water is too precious to waste on extensive washing. And besides, getting thoroughly wet when the temperature hovers near freezing would be dangerous rather than refreshing. Instead, you make do with minimal cleaning using small amounts of warmed water. A wooden bowl holds perhaps a cup of water that has been heated by the fire. With a rough cloth, you wash face and hands in slow, careful motions, preserving as much warmth as possible while removing the day's accumulation of dirt and sweat. Teeth cleaning involves chewing on frayed twigs, usually birch or willow, which have natural antiseptic properties. The process is meditative rather than thorough. You work the fibrous end of the stick around your mouth, paying attention to each tooth individually. There's no hurry because there's nowhere else to be and nothing else that requires immediate attention. The bitter taste of the wood gradually becomes familiar, even comforting, as it signals the approaching end of another successfully survived day. Hair maintenance in winter requires special consideration. Long hair, which most Vikings maintain regardless of gender, becomes a liability in cold weather, if not properly managed. Before sleep, it must be braided tightly to prevent tangling and to keep it away from your face during the night. The braiding process is methodical and soothing. You section the hair into 3 equal portions, then weave them together with practiced movements. Each crossing of the strands is deliberate and even. The finished braid gets secured with a thin strip of leather or wool cord, tied firmly enough to hold through a night of sleep, but not so tight as to cause discomfort. Clothing for sleep presents its own set of considerations. You don't simply remove your day clothes and put on night clothes because such luxuries don't exist in your world. Instead, you make strategic adjustments to what you're already wearing. The heavy outer cloak comes off, but everything else stays on for warmth. You might loosen the leg wrapping slightly to improve circulation, or adjust the position of your belt, but the basic layers remain in place. Removing too much clothing would mean waking up dangerously cold in a few hours when the fire burns low. The evening fire tending becomes perhaps the most crucial routine of the entire day. This fire must last through the night without active maintenance, which means the banking process requires exceptional care and attention. First, you allow the flames to burn down to a steady bed of red-hot coals. This takes time because you can't rush the process without wasting fuel. The coals need to be deep and evenly distributed across the fire pit, glowing with consistent heat rather than flaring with dramatic flames. Once the coal bed reaches the proper state, you begin the banking process. Using a long-handled wooden shovel, you carefully cover the coals with a layer of ash. This ash acts as insulation, slowing the burning process and preserving the heat for hours. Too much ash smothers the fire completely. Too little allows it to burn too quickly and die before morning. The covering must be applied gradually, with frequent pauses to observe how the coals respond. You watch for changes in color and heat output, adjusting your technique based on these subtle indicators. The final step involves adding 1 or 2 large logs to the banked fire. These logs are positioned carefully to catch the remaining heat and begin their own slow burn. They won't burst into flame immediately, but will gradually ignite over the course of several hours, providing steady warmth through the coldest part of the night. The placement of these logs requires consideration of airflow, fuel consumption, and heat distribution. Each piece of wood is positioned to maximize efficiency while minimizing the risk of the fire, either burning too quickly or dying out entirely. With the fire properly banked and the sleeping arrangements prepared, the longhouse settles into its nighttime rhythm. Oil lamps are extinguished one by one to conserve fuel. The last lamp to go out illuminates the final preparations of the household. Tools are set aside in their proper places. Food containers are covered and secured against mice or other small creatures that might venture inside, seeking warmth and sustenance. Every item has its designated location, and returning things to their proper places becomes second nature when living space is limited. An organization means the difference between comfort and chaos. The transition from wakefulness to sleep happens gradually rather than suddenly. You lie on your carefully prepared bedding, listening to the subtle sounds of the longhouse settling around you. The wooden beams creak softly as they contract in the cold. The banked fire whispers and pops occasionally as pockets of moisture in the wood heat up and expand. Outside, the wind might moan through the bare branches of trees, but inside, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, these sounds become a lullaby rather than a threat. Your breathing slows and deepens as warmth gradually spreads through your body beneath the layers of wool and fur. The carefully banked fire continues its slow, steady burn, radiating heat that reaches your makeshift bed in gentle waves. Each exhale creates a small puff of vapor in the cold air, visible for just a moment before dissipating into the darkness. The rhythm of your breathing synchronizes with the subtle sounds of the longhouse, creating a peaceful harmony that signals the successful completion of another day's survival. But sleep doesn't come immediately, even when exhaustion weighs heavily on your limbs. The Viking winter night stretches endlessly ahead, and your mind naturally turns to the tasks that await tomorrow. There will be more wood to split, more porridge to stir, more careful rationing of precious supplies. The routine never varies significantly, because variation in winter can mean disaster. Consistency becomes a virtue, repetition a form of security against the unpredictable dangers that cold weather brings. As consciousness gradually fades, your last thoughts focus on the reassuring presence of the banked fire. You know that in 6 or 7 hours, you'll wake to find glowing coals still warm beneath their blanket of ash, ready to be coaxed back to life with the same patient breathing and careful tending that started this day. The cycle will begin again, methodical and unchanging, carrying you through another rotation of survival in the endless winter darkness. Now let us drift forward through time and across vast distances to explore another realm of historical tedium, equally suited to peaceful contemplation. We find ourselves in medieval England, specifically in the year 1347, where the daily routine of a Benedictine monastery offers its own particular brand of soothing repetition. Here, in the stone corridors of religious devotion, life moves according to rhythms established centuries ago and maintained with religious precision. Brother Thomas rises each morning at precisely 2 o'clock, not because an alarm clock summons him, but because decades of monastic discipline have trained his body to wake at this hour without fail. The monastery bell tower remains silent at this early hour, its bronze bells waiting for the appointed time of matins. Instead, Brother Thomas wakes to the subtle sounds of other monks stirring in their individual cells. The soft whisper of wool robes against stone floors, the gentle creak of wooden doors opening along the dormitory corridor. His cell measures exactly 8 feet by 6 feet, furnished with the bare minimum required for survival and contemplation. A narrow wooden bed with a straw mattress, a small wooden stool, a basin for washing, and a shelf holding his few personal possessions. The walls are bare stone, cold to the touch year-round, but Brother Thomas has long since ceased to notice such physical discomforts. His attention focuses instead on the morning routine that will occupy the next several hours with methodical precision. The first task involves dressing in the regulation Benedictine habit. This isn't simply a matter of throwing on clothes, but rather a ritualized process that serves as a form of moving meditation. The undergarment goes on first, a simple linen tunic that extends to mid-thigh. Over this comes the main robe, made of coarse brown wool that scratches slightly against the skin, but provides adequate warmth in the unheated monastery. The scapula, a rectangular piece of cloth worn over the shoulders, comes next, symbolizing the yoke of Christ that each monk bears willingly. Finally, the leather belt that holds everything in place, threaded through the rope cincture with practiced movements that require no conscious thought. Each piece of clothing is adjusted with care to ensure proper fit and appearance. Wrinkles are smoothed away, hems arranged to hang at precisely the correct length. The process takes exactly the same amount of time each morning, because Brother Thomas has performed these movements thousands of times over the past 15 years of monastic life. Personal hygiene follows its own strict schedule. The basin in his cell holds cold water, drawn fresh from the monastery well the previous evening. Brother Thomas washes his face and hands with deliberate slowness, using a rough cloth and a small piece of soap made from ash and animal fat. The soap lathers poorly and leaves a slight residue on the skin, but it serves its purpose of basic cleanliness. His teeth receive attention from a frayed twig, chewed methodically until the fibers separate and can be used to scrub away the night's accumulation of morning mouth. The walk from the dormitory to the chapel for matins follows corridors worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet. Brother Thomas's footsteps echo softly against the stone arches overhead, joining with the footsteps of 30 other monks, making the same journey at the same pace they've maintained for years. No one speaks during this procession. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribes periods of silence, and the early morning hours fall under this restriction. Instead, the monks move like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness, each following the path memorized through countless repetitions. The chapel itself feels vast and empty in the flickering light of oil lamps placed at strategic intervals along the walls. Brother Thomas takes his assigned place in the choir stalls, a specific spot determined by his position in the monastery hierarchy and his years of service. The wooden seat is worn smooth by decades of use, shaped perfectly to accommodate long periods of sitting during the various prayer services that punctuate each day. He arranges his robe carefully to avoid wrinkles and settles into position for the first of 7 daily prayer services. Matins begins with a single voice chanting the opening verse, followed by the entire community joining in response. The Latin phrases flow with practiced ease, each monk knowing his part without reference to written music or text. The chanting follows ancient melodies that rise and fall with hypnotic regularity, creating an atmosphere of timeless devotion that transcends individual personality or preference. Brother Thomas's voice blends with the others, neither standing out nor remaining silent, contributing to the collective harmony that defines monastic worship. The service continues for exactly 1 hour, divided into 3 sections called nocturnes. Each nocturne includes specific psalms, readings from scripture, and responsories that follow patterns established centuries ago. Brother Thomas knows these patterns so thoroughly that his mind can focus on the meaning of the words, rather than struggling to remember what comes next. The repetition becomes a form of meditation, allowing deeper contemplation of spiritual truths, while the familiar phrases roll off his tongue with automatic precision. Following matins comes a brief period of private prayer and contemplation before the next scheduled activity. Brother Thomas returns to his cell, where he kneels on the stone floor beside his bed and engages in personal dialogue with the divine. This isn't dramatic or emotional prayer, but rather quiet conversation conducted in whispered Latin, or sometimes in complete silence. He reviews his intentions for the day, examines his conscience for failings from the previous day, and requests guidance for the challenges that lie ahead. The bell for Lords rings at exactly 6 o'clock, summoning the community back to the chapel for the second prayer service of the day. This follows the same general pattern as Matins, but with different psalms and readings, appropriate to the morning hour. The chapel has grown slightly warmer as more oil lamps have been lit, but the stone walls still radiate cold that penetrates through wool robes and into the bones of anyone sitting still for extended periods. Brother Thomas has learned to ignore such physical discomfort, focusing instead on the spiritual nourishment provided by communal worship. After Lords comes the first meal of the day, though calling it breakfast would be overly generous. The refectory, a long hall with wooden tables and benches arranged in precise rows, accommodates the entire community for silent dining. Brother Thomas takes his assigned seat at one of the middle tables, neither with the senior monks near the abbot's table, nor with the newest novices relegated to the back of the room. His position reflects his status as a monk of moderate seniority, respected but not elevated to positions of particular authority or influence. The meal consists of bread, watered wine, and sometimes a small portion of cheese or dried fruit, depending on the season and the monastery's current financial situation. The bread is dark and coarse, made from barley and rye flour ground in the monastery's own mill. It's substantial rather than flavorful, designed to provide necessary calories for the physical labor that will occupy much of the day ahead. Brother Thomas chews each bite slowly and thoroughly, both to aid digestion and to extend the eating process to fill the allotted time for the meal. During breakfast, one of the monks reads aloud from a religious text, while the others eat in silence. Today's reading comes from the writings of St. Augustine, dense theological commentary that requires careful attention to follow the complex arguments being presented. Brother Thomas listens while eating, his mind engaged with both the physical act of consuming food and the intellectual exercise of understanding Augustine's teachings about divine grace and human free will. The combination of mental and physical activity creates a meditative state that carries him peacefully through the meal. The reading continues for exactly 30 minutes, timed not by clock, but by the reader's practiced sense of appropriate pacing. When the designated time expires, the reader concludes at the end of the current paragraph, regardless of where that might fall in the overall text. Tomorrow's reading will begin precisely where today's ended, ensuring that over the course of weeks or months, the entire work will be completed without gaps or repetitions. Following breakfast comes the work period that will occupy most of the morning hours. Brother Thomas's assigned task involves copying manuscripts in the monastery's scriptorium, a large room filled with wooden writing desks positioned to catch the maximum amount of natural light from tall windows facing east. His particular specialty involves copying medical treatises, works that require careful attention to detail, because errors in dosage or procedure could have serious consequences for anyone using the finished manuscripts. And there, in the quiet scratch of quill against parchment, in the methodical rhythm of monastic bells, in the gentle whisper of turning pages, we find the same soothing cadence that carried our Viking ancestors through their frozen nights. These ordinary moments, these unremarkable routines of survival and devotion, remind us that history isn't always thunder and lightning. Sometimes it's simply the soft sound of breathing, the patient tending of fires, the careful preservation of knowledge. Sweet dreams.